Redcoat or redcoat is a historical term used to refer to soldiers of the British Army and Royal Marines because of the red uniforms formerly worn by the majority of infantry regiments. From the mid-17th century to the 19th century, the uniform of most British soldiers included a madder red coat or coatee. From 1873 onwards, the more vivid shade of scarlet was adopted for all ranks, having previously been worn only by officers, sergeants and all ranks of some cavalry regiments. History. The red coat has evolved from being the British infantryman's ordinary uniform to a garment retained only for ceremonial purposes. Its official adoption dates from February 1645, when the Parliament of England passed the new Model Army Ordinance. The new English army was formed of 22,000 men, divided into 12-foot regiments of 600 men each, one dragoon regiment of 1,000 men, and the artillery, consisting of 900 guns. The infantry regiments wore coats of Venetian red with white facings. A contemporary comment on the new model army dated 7 May 1645 stated, "The men are red coats all. The whole army only are distinguished by the several facings of their coats." There had been isolated instances of red military clothing predating its general adoption by the new model army. The uniforms of the yeomen of the Guard and the yeomen warders have traditionally been in Tudor red and gold. The gentlemen pensioners of James I had worn red with yellow feathers. At Edgehill, the first battle of the Civil War, the King's people had worn red coats, as had at least 2 parliamentary regiments. However, none of these examples constituted the national uniform that the red coat was later to become. The English red coat made its first appearance on a European continental battlefield at the Battle of the Dunes in 1658. A Protectorate army had been landed at Calais the previous year and every man had a new red coat and a new pair of shoes. The English name from the battle comes from the major engagement carried out by the Redcoats. To the amazement of continental observers, they stormed sand dunes 150 feet high, fighting experienced Spanish soldiers from their summits with musket fire and push of pike. The adoption and continuing use of red by most English soldiers after the Restoration was the result of circumstances rather than policy, including the relative cheapness of red dyes. Red was by no means universal at first, with grey and blue coats also being worn. There is no known basis for the myth that red coats were favoured because they did not show blood stains. Blood does in fact show on red clothing as a black stain. Prior to 1707, colonels of regiments made their own arrangements for the manufacture of uniforms under their command. This ended when a royal warrant of 16 January 1707 established a board of general officers to regulate the clothing of the army. Uniforms supplied were to conform to the sealed pattern agreed by the board. The style of the coat tended to follow those worn by other European armies. The long coat worn with a white or buff-colored waistcoat was discontinued in 1797 in favor of a tight-fitting coatee fastened with a single row of buttons, with white lace loops on either side. Following the discomfort experienced by troops in the Crimean War, a more practical tunic was introduced in 1855, initially in the French double-breasted style, but replaced by a single-breasted version in the following year. From an early stage, red coat were lined with contrasting colors and turned out to provide distinctive regimental facings. Examples were blue for the 8th Regiment of Foot, green for the 5th Regiment of Foot, yellow for the 44th Regiment of Foot and buff for the 3rd Regiment of Foot. 1747 saw the first of a series of clothing regulations and royal warrants that set out the various facing colors and distinctions to be borne by each regiment. An attempt at standardization was made following the Childers reforms of 1881, with English and Welsh regiments having white, Scottish yellow, Irish green and Royal regiments dark blue. However, some regiments were subsequently able to obtain the reintroduction of historic facing colors that had been uniquely theirs. British soldiers fought in scarlet tunics for the last time at the Battle of Guenis in the Sudan on 30 December 1885. They formed part of an expeditionary force sent from Britain to participate in the Nile Campaign of 1884–85, wearing the home service uniform of the period including scarlet tunics, although some regiments sent from India were in khaki drill. A small detachment of infantry which reached Khartoum by steamer on 28 January 1885 were ordered to fight in their red coats in order to let the Mahdist rebels know that the real British forces had arrived. Even after the adoption of khaki service dress in 1902, most British infantry regiments and some cavalry regiments continued to wear scarlet tunics on parade and for off-duty, walking-out dress, until the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, while nearly all technical and support branches of the Army wore dark blue. The Royal Engineers had worn red since the Peninsular War in order to draw less fire when serving amongst red-coated infantry. Scarlet tunics ceased to be general issue upon British mobilisation in August 1914. The Brigade of Guards resumed wearing their scarlet full dress in 1920, but for the remainder of the Army red coats were only authorised for wear by regimental bands and officers in mess dress or on certain limited social or ceremonial occasions. As late as 1980, consideration was given to the reintroduction of scarlet as a replacement for the dark blue No. 1 dress and khaki No. 2 dress of the modern British Army, using cheaper and fadeless chemical dyes instead of cochineal. Surveys of serving soldiers' opinion showed little support for the idea and it was shelved. Royal Marines. Red coats were first worn by British seagoing regiments when adopted by the Prince of Denmark's regiment in 1686. Thereafter red coatees became the normal parade and battle dress for marine infantry, although the staining effects of salt spray meant that white fatigue jackets and subsequently blue undress tunics were often substituted for shipboard duties. The Royal Marine Artillery wore dark blue from their creation in 1804. The scarlet full-dress tunics of the Royal Marine Light Infantry were abolished in 1923 when the two branches of the Corps were amalgamated and dark blue became the universal uniform colour for both ceremonial and ordinary occasions. Modern use in Commonwealth armies. In the modern British Army, scarlet is still worn by the Foot Guards, the Life Guards, and by some regimental bands or drummers for ceremonial purposes. Officers and NCOs of those regiments which previously wore red retained scarlet as the colour of their mess or formal evening jackets. Some regiments turn out small detachments, such as colour guards, in scarlet full dress at their own expense, e.g., the Yorkshire Regiment before amalgamation. The Royal Gibraltar Regiment has a scarlet tunic in its winter dress. Scarlet is also retained for some full dress, military band or mess uniforms in the modern armies of a number of the countries that made up the British Empire. These include the Australian, Jamaican, New Zealand, Fijian, Canadian, Kenyan, Ghanaian, Indian, Singaporean, Sri Lankan and Pakistani armies. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police also wear a red serge jacket, based on a British military pattern tunic. Redcoat as a symbol. The epithet, redcoats, is familiar throughout much of the former British Empire, even though this colour was by no means exclusive to the British Army. The entire Danish Army wore red coats up to 1848 and particular units in the German, French, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, Bulgarian and Romanian armies retained red uniforms until 1914 or later. Amongst other diverse examples, Spanish Hussars, Japanese Navy and United States Marine Corps bandsmen, and Serbian generals had red tunics as part of their gala or court dress during this period. In 1827 U.S. Artillery company musicians were wearing red coats as a reversal of their branch-facing color. However, the extensive use of this color by British, Indian and other imperial soldiers over a period of nearly 300 years made red uniform a veritable icon of the British Empire. The significance of military red as a national symbol was endorsed by King William IV when light dragoons and lancers had scarlet jackets, substituted for their previous dark blue. Hussars adopted red pelisses, and even the Royal Navy were obliged to adopt red facings instead of white. Most of these changes were reversed under Queen Victoria. A red coat and black tricorn remains part of the ceremonial and out-of-hospital dress for in-pensioners at the Royal Hospital, Chelsea. American Revolution. In the United States, redcoat is associated in cultural memory with the British soldiers who fought against the colonists during the American Revolutionary War. The Library of Congress possesses several examples of the uniforms the British Army used during this time. Most soldiers that fought the colonists wore the red coat, though the Hessian mercenaries and some locally recruited loyalist units had blue or green clothing. Accounts of the time usually refer to British soldiers as regulars or the King's Men. However, there is evidence of the term redcoats being used informally, as a colloquial expression. During the Siege of Boston, on the 4th of January 1776, George Washington uses the term redcoats in a letter to Joseph Reed. In an earlier letter dated 13 October 1775, Washington used a variation of the expression, stating, "Whenever the redcoat gentry pleases to step out of their entrenchments," Major General John Stark of the Continental Army was purported to have said, during the Battle of Bennington, "There are your enemies, the redcoats and the Tories. They are ours." Or "This night Molly Stark sleeps a widow." Other pejorative nicknames for British soldiers included bloody backs, and lobsters, and black powder. Battlefield visibility was quickly obscured by clouds of smoke. Bright colors provided a means of distinguishing friend from foe without significantly adding risk. Furthermore, the vegetable dyes used until the 19th century would fade over time to a pink or ruddy brown. So on a long campaign in a hot climate, the color was less conspicuous than the modern scarlet shade would be. As battles of the time were also commonly fought in large, conspicuous lines and columns on the battlefield with volley fire, the individual soldier was not a target by himself, making the obviousness of his presence immaterial. As noted above, no historical basis can be found for the suggestion that the color red was favored because of the supposedly demoralizing effect of bloodstains on a uniform of a lighter color. In his book British Military Uniforms, the military historian W.Y. Carman traces in considerable detail the slow evolution of red as the English soldier's color, from the Tudors to the Stuarts. The reasons that emerge are a mixture of financial, cultural, and simple chance. Before the Tudor period, red frequently appeared in the cloth livery provided for the household personnel, including guard troops, of many European royal houses and Italian or church principalities. During the English Civil War, red dyes were imported in large quantities for use by units and individuals of both sides. Though this was the beginning of the trend for long overcoats, the ready availability of red pigment made it popular for military clothing, and the dyeing process required for red involved only one stage. Other colors involved the mixing of dyes in 2 stages and accordingly involved greater expense. Blue, for example, could be obtained with woad, but more popularly it became the much more expensive indigo. In financial terms, the only cheaper alternative was the grey-white of undyed wool, an option favored by the French, Austrian, Spanish and other continental armies. The formation of the First English Standing Army saw red clothing as the standard dress. As Carman comments, the red coat was now firmly established as the sign of an Englishman. On traditional battlefields with large engagements, visibility was not considered a military disadvantage until the general adoption of rifles in the 1850s, followed by smokeless powder after 1880. The value of drab clothing was quickly recognized by the British Army, who introduced khaki drill for Indian and colonial warfare from the mid-19th century on. As part of a series of reforms following the Second Boer War, a darker khaki serge was adopted in 1902 for service dress in Britain itself. From then on, the red coat continued as a dress item only, retained for reasons both of national sentiment and its value in recruiting. The British military authorities were more practical in their considerations than their French counterparts, who incurred heavy casualties by retaining highly visible blue coats and red trousers for active service until several months into World War I. Material used: whether scarlet or red. The uniform coat has historically been made of wool with a lining of a loosely woven wool known as bay to give shape to the garment. The modern scarlet wool is supplied by Abermeleich Hainsworth, and is much lighter than the traditional material, which was intended for hardware on active service. The cloth for private soldiers used up until the late 18th century was plain weave broadcloth weighing 16 ounces per square yard, made from coarser blends of English wool. The weights often quoted in contemporary documents are given per running yard, though, so for a cloth of 54 width a yard weighed 24 ounces. This sometimes leads to the erroneous statement that the cloth weighed 24 ounces per square yard. Broadcloth is so called not because it is finished wide, 54 not being particularly so, but because it was woven nearly half as wide again and shrunk down to finish 54. This shrinking, or milling, process made the cloth very dense, bringing all the threads very tightly together, and gave a felted blind finish to the cloth. These factors meant that it was harder wearing, more weatherproof and could take a raw edge. The hems of the garment could be simply cut and left without hemming as the threads were so heavily shrunk together as to prevent fraying. Officers' coats were made from superfine broadcloth, manufactured from much finer imported Spanish wool, spun finer and with more warps and wefts per inch. The result was a slightly lighter cloth than that used for privates. Still essentially a broadcloth and maintaining the characteristics of that cloth, but slightly lighter and with a much finer quality finish. The dye used for privates' coats of the infantry, garden line, was madder, a vegetable dye. It was recognized as economical, simple and reliable, and remained the first choice for lower quality reds from the ancient world until chemical dyes became cheaper in the latter 19th century. Infantry sergeants, some cavalry regiments and many volunteer corps used various mock scarlets, a brighter red but derived from cheaper materials than the cochineal, used for officers' coats. Various dye sources were used for these middle-quality reds, but lac, pigment extracted from the vegetable resin shellac, was the most common basis. The non-commissioned officer's red coat issued under the warrant of 1768. Was dyed with a mixture of madder red and cochineal to produce a lesser scarlet, brighter than the red worn by other ranks but cheaper than the pure cochineal dyed garment purchased by officers as a personal order from military tailors. Officers' superfine broadcloth was dyed true scarlet with cochineal, a dye derived from insects. This was a more expensive process, but produced a distinctive color that was the speciality of 18th-century English dyers.